Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by goVirtualOffice. GVO is ERP Simplified. Today's program is all about SuiteScripts and workflows, so a NetSuite focused presentation for you. And Greg and Leslie are here to share with you what to automate and then what you might want to just leave alone, which is helpful in a world where we hear so much about automate, learning from the experts to know when to automate and when not to. That's an important differentiation. So Greg, Leslie, I'm so glad to have you here. We'll go ahead on to the next slide, and I'd like to share some opening announcements. It's wonderful to be here as your host. I'll be in the background just monitoring questions and helping to make sure everything runs smoothly, handling the polling questions for you all. Today's program, of course, qualifies for CPE credit. You'll want to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions and remain in session for at least 50 minutes. And when you earn your CPE credit, you'll be able to log into your in-course dashboard, and your CPE certificate will populate for you an hour after the program ends. So go ahead out there. Of course, on your in-course dashboard is a great place to save and store your certificates, and we'll make the resources available for you as well. So the handouts are available to you through GoToWebinar and after the webinar on your in-course dashboard, and then the recording will be uploaded there as well. So you'll have a portal to get everything you need for the resources following the program today. We would love to hear from you. If you joined us early, you probably heard some of our conversation, which spanned from logistics and setup to locations and summer plans. So if you want to go ahead and say hello and let us know where you're joining from, we would love to give you all a warm welcome. If you're on LinkedIn, I would highly recommend connecting with the goVirtualOffice team and following Greg and Leslie and continuing the conversation and build your network and the relationships far beyond just the webinar today. Hello to Julie joining us from Massachusetts. Great to have you here, and thanks for saying hello. It's a pleasure to welcome back goVirtualOffice. goVirtualOffice is a premier sponsor of continuing education through Incoursa. As I mentioned when you all joined, this is about ERP Simplified, and their team has decades of experience with NetSuite, with other ERPs, and their team is really the leading edge to help you all with your ERP. And so we're really excited to have Greg here and Leslie. Greg was sharing that he has over 13 years experience with NetSuite. Leslie shared that she has over 8 years experience. So Greg and Leslie are experts. They're here for you today, so feel free to ask questions, and we'll keep an open dialogue. Hello to Lisa joining us from Texas and Chris from St. Louis, Missouri. So welcome, everyone. Leslie and Greg, without further ado, I would love to turn things over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Liz. All right. So as Liz mentioned, today we are talking SuiteScripts and workflows. When to use one versus the other, when to automate, and when to just stick with what you're doing. So quick introductions. I'm Leslie Chicker. I am a senior business consultant with goVirtualOffice. As Liz had mentioned, been with the company about 8 years using NetSuite, have lots of additional work experience in customer service, accounting, manufacturing, as you know, to run the gamut. So been able to walk the walk and now talk the talk, applying it to NetSuite. Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you for a quick intro.
And I am Greg Lendner. I'm a master software engineer at goVirtualOffice. I've been doing software engineering for about 35 years, and the last 13 of it mostly in the NetSuite space, using SuiteScript, which is primarily JavaScript with its own custom API. And I guess that's pretty much it about me.
Thank you both.
All right. So it looks like we have our first poll, right, Liz?
Let's do it. Okay, so we're going to start out here with our first polling question. The question for all of your consideration is, are you getting the most out of your NetSuite account? So if you are a NetSuite user and you want to raise your hand to say, yes, I'm getting the most out of your NetSuite account, we have some confident attendees today, so that's really exciting. If you don't think you are, or if you're unsure, that is okay. I think Leslie and Greg can speak to this, that NetSuite is adding new features and NetSuite is growing as your organization is growing. And so this is not a static optimization here. So it's okay if your answer is not yes. And if you're not on yet NetSuite, hopefully what you hear today might encourage you to think about the capabilities of a platform like NetSuite. 92% of the audience voted in this poll, so I'm sharing the results here on the screen. And I'll go ahead and close that poll, and we'll kick it back over to you, Leslie.
Great. All right. So automation, right? Automation can be very powerful, but it also can be a deterrent too. So some of the things we'll get into before we consider automation is, maybe just making sure you understand your process. But automation can be very helpful, especially nowadays, right? A lot of us are wearing multiple hats. So to be able to take some of those manual daily tasks off of our plates so that we could free up our time to be more the strategizers and looking at the bigger picture, that always helps. Some of the manual slowness, right, that comes with those manual processes. So, if somebody is doing an approval and now you've got to wait for that to be handed off, those could slow down your progress. Errors, something happens from an error and you don't have any validation. What starts as a small error upstream could end up being a large or a bigger issue as it moves through your processes. Approvals, they just get stuck, right? Maybe somebody's on vacation and you didn't take that into consideration and now it's stuck at that point. I apologize, you guys. Periodically, my screen share seems to want to just refresh. But as we talk through it while it's coming back on, some reporting, right? Depending on that automation, we can get those reports created instead of them being manually kicked off and just be sent out to those that need to get them. And then we have our over customization. So, right, understanding when is the right time to use automation. Sometimes you get caught up in wanting to use automation and you think that that's what you have to do, but you're over customizing something that could be just a simple task because we didn't really understand what the requirement was at first. Greg, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to say that when I think about automation, if you have a task that you could write down, hand it off to somebody else to do, it's probably a candidate for automation.
That's a great point. Great point. All right. As Greg alluded to, what is good automation? So repetitive manual tasks. If it's something that you do on a daily basis and there's a lot of manual work that goes into it, you might want to consider that for automation. Accuracy, right? If we really want to have those validations around it, that might be a good case for automation. And then just to have that approvals or that visual of it. In NetSuite, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but there's the idea of workflows and scripts. And once you get those in place, now we can use those to put things on your dashboards as reminders, or even, something just right on the main part of your dashboard. So you've got that visibility to see it on a regular basis. And, it's just in the forefront so that we could keep that task or approval, whatever it may be, moving right along. All right, so today we're going to kind of talk through, there are a couple of ways in NetSuite that you can automate. We've got workflows. So those are, built right in NetSuite. They're, anybody can use them. They can be built up really with ease of use. depending again on our processes, we're going to talk about those. There's some structure to them, right? So we'll give some examples of what those look like, but it's a little more of a structured process. So A goes to B, goes to C. They're a little easier to maintain just from the idea of permissions and the day-to-day task users. Once they build one out, it's fairly easy for them to be able to maintain it. And then as we talked about a little bit already, they're really good for approvals and basic approvals, but we'll talk about that in one of our examples. SuiteScripts, as Greg had kind of talked about in the beginning when he was giving his introduction, SuiteScripts are based a lot on Java. So if, you know, and writing code a little bit. So it takes that skill set to be able to do some of the scripts that are created. And so then with those, knowing where the points are for integration with them, there's conversations or verbiage around it upon creation of the record or upon save of the record, right? When some of these scripts handle. So it's really understanding some of that from a maintenance standpoint. So that's where you have more of your technicals that can maintain those, but it does give you more flexibility. And again, as we get later into this presentation, we're going to give you some examples about how these will play out. Okay, so workflows, approvals, an easy conversation that, and again, we'll talk about this more, but if you need like a purchase order approved, right? In NetSuite, we can use workflows because it can build not only off of the process needing it, but you've got the concept of the employee record and there can be some data elements there. And then you kind of put the two together and that's how you write your workflow for like a purchase order approval. There's some others around just updating a field. If this field updates, maybe we want this data point to go into this field. Some simple, basic, like we said, linear processes, that's when it's great to use workflows. SuiteScripts, right? That's when our logic gets more complex. So yes, we want to have certain approvals, and again, we'll get into the more detailed examples, but let's say we want a purchase order approval, but it's not just based off of the employee record and its next supervisor or dollar amounts on there. We want to have, if it's this type of product, we want it to go to this person. If it's this type, so maybe we're getting into more complex requirements that now we want to consider SuiteScripts for. Okay. And then again, like we talked about, if there's a need for it to run at a certain time, or if we want it to run in the background while something else is happening, that's when we want to consider SuiteScripts. All right, I think we have another poll question coming up here.
Happy to do that. So we will launch our second polling question now. And the question is on the screen. What is your biggest NetSuite automation challenge right now? Interested to hear from you. Is it manual processes and having too many of them? Having workflows or scripts that are hard to maintain? Maybe you're in a position where you would like to use more automation as part of your workflows, but you're not exactly sure what should be automated. Maybe you've built some existing automation and maybe that's causing some issues. And again, I know we have many NetSuite users and many possibly future NetSuite users. Helpful just to see where you're all at right now. And it looks like automation is not causing too many issues at this point. So that's encouraging to see. Let's go ahead and take a look here at the results. And for those on NetSuite, it's a mix of manual processes and then not exactly sure what to automate. So I think we're moving in the direction.
Yes, absolutely. All right. So Great segue. What should be automated, right? I think Greg had kind of talked about it when he was mentioning earlier. So those repetitive tasks, if it's something that you find yourself doing on a regular basis, on a daily, weekly, maybe that's something we want to consider automating. Approvals is always kind of that low-hanging fruit of what makes sense to automate. Validation, if we need to run some validation on making sure that fields are filled in or that complete information is done, that's when you can help with some of that error prevention. Notifications and escalations, right? Maybe you don't have, maybe as we get through our approval process and an approver, we get up to the controller, maybe the president level, they're not necessarily in NetSuite all the time. Maybe that's where we could do some automation to send them to email with the link to bring them back in to be able to do that approval. And then process handoffs, right? A nice way to help keep that process flowing, to be able to use some automation to get that handoff to the next person. What do we want to leave alone? Broken processes, right? So we always want to try and go in with a clear, defined process before we start automating. In some cases, if it's a brand new process too, right? Maybe we want to vet it a little bit and just understand it as a manual before we really want to put some automation around it. One-off exceptions. So if it's something that comes up, as a rare occurrence, we don't necessarily want to take that as something to automate, because maybe that one-off, when it comes up as an exception, it's got some variances to it each time that it happens. Human judgment. So again, we've talked a little bit about approvals and automating approvals. It's automating the routing of approvals, right? Yes, there might be some instances where we could say if A and B equals C, go ahead and automatically approve it. But we might be just routing the process that needs to be approved, because that human interaction needs to still happen to make sure that the data that's there, or the spend, right? Maybe that's where we see a lot of the approvals is, okay, up to $2,500, for example, automatically approve it. But now when it gets up over 25, we want to route it through the automation, but we still want that human eyes on the paper to make sure that that spend is okay. No clear ownership, right? So that's where it's, if we're going to try and set up validation or approval routing, if there's not that ownership, then it's kind of hard to define where that automation needs to land if we don't know who the owner of it is. And then again, complex customizations. So if we don't have that clear, defined process, we might be missing some of the pieces of that complex customization to really understand it and make sure that we've got it all taken into consideration when we're doing that automation. Greg, anything you want to add there?
I think that says it well.
Great. All right. Here's just some high-level questions to ask. So, right, again, is that process repeatable? Do we have a clear idea of what we want those rules to be? Does it happen often enough, right? So is this that one-off exception, or is this something that really does happen a lot? Will that automation, right, again, having that clear rules and understanding that process, with the automation, we can help reduce the errors and get that validation and visibility. And then who owns the process to make sure, because not only can we create the automation, but having an owner on that process, right? Now, if something changes in the process, we got to come back into that automation and make sure that the automation is set up to support the changes that are happening as well. And then Can we handle it with natural NetSuite first, as we're talking NetSuite here? Or do we need to add some customization layers on this? And I think Greg and I are going to talk about an example of that further on in the presentation here. And then that's where we're going to also talk through too. Is a workflow enough to handle the automation, or because of the processes and we're getting a little more complex, now we need to move to the SuiteScript. All right.
Quote for you, Leslie, related to your comment about the problems, right? So the quote is, automation doesn't fix problems, it amplifies them. So make sure that you're not trying to automate something that you do have problems doing.
Exactly, right?
So you want to get some bad data fast, automate a bad process.
Good point. All right. So just a simple decision guide here. When to use workflows, SuiteScript, and leave it alone. So workflows, simple logic. You know, you've got an admin or somebody that's part of that process that can maintain it. And, you know, we've already talked a little bit too about some of the areas: approvals, alerts, simple field updates, status changes. That's a great time to use workflows. SuiteScripts, right? Now we're getting a little more complex. The processes have a lot more if, then, or else statements in them. And so we need a little more customization than what those workflows can give us. And when to leave it alone, we've already talked about it a little bit, right? We haven't clearly defined our processes yet. Doesn't happen that often. And, you know, we need some human intervention there. All right, another poll question.
So now we'll look ahead to the areas that you would most like to automate. We'll go ahead and launch the third polling question, and go ahead and let us know if you are in the situation where you have the opportunity to automate, or perhaps you're working on that. Would you like to start with approvals, notifications and reminders, data validation, reporting and follow-up, or integrations and background processes? So you gave us 3 columns of what is helpful to automate, what you might want to write a SuiteScript for, what not to automate. When you're talking with professionals who have NetSuite, the ability to add some of these elements of automation, but they're not sure where to start, can you recap, just based upon this list that's on our screen now, where do you typically recommend starting?
So it's really doing the requirements, right, for your process. If you have a nice, clear, defined process, just by looking at that, you know, Venn or Visio or whatever you might have for your process, just by looking at that, you're gonna kind of already get a feel for which direction you want to go, right? If you're doing the Visio and you could see, yep, we go this way linear, or if we get a no, then we go this way linear. That's going to help you know that it's a workflow, right? But if we start getting into those Visios and we need to go here and then we go here and then we got to circle back here, that's kind of probably giving you an idea that we've got more of a SuiteScript, right?
Yeah, that's if the decision tree gets too many layers or too many if, then, but.
Right.
Just
because there are a lot of if-thens doesn't mean that it's not something you should not automate.
Right.
If-thens are just more into the SuiteScript version of automation than in the workflow version of
Absolutely.
Automation. So again, if you can write it down, if you can provide clear instruction to a user to do some task, it almost certainly can be automated.
Good point of clarification there, Greg. Thanks for speaking into that. Well, let's go ahead and close the polling question, and we'll take a look at the results together. So we have data validation. Actually, so this is like kind of neck and neck: integrations and background processes, approvals, reporting and follow-up.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Would you expect that to find data validation first? I'm not in this as much every day as you are. I kind of expected that approvals would take the lead, but approvals got edged out by a few other areas first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't shock me that
Go ahead,
validation
Greg.
takes the lead.
Yeah.
That is typically where I get involved with automating something, is trying to prevent errors downstream. So people want to validate that everything is all kosher before moving things forward.
Jerry from the audience wrote in and said, could be all of the above. So thinking ahead, let's add some automation in every one of these areas. And it's always hard when we have to go with just one. Which
Right.
one do you most want? Well, let's go ahead and close that polling question, and we'll move into our next segment here.
Okay. Oh, and it looks like my screen sharing stopped. There we go. Apologies for that. All right, we're back. So, real world examples. All right. So we want to send a reminder email for incomplete records, right? Maybe we've defined on an item setup, or we're going to, let's say item setup. We know that on a minimum, we need certain fields to be filled in. That's where maybe we could write a simple workflow, right? To do a quick field check to make sure that these 10 fields are filled in. Otherwise, we're sending an email to the person that is responsible for those item setups. Simple enough, right? Another case for it, and this is where we're going to build off of it. So we talked about approvals, right? We have a vendor bill that we're going to route for approvals. Great. We can define, right, the dollar amounts and the who's, and we could play off of in NetSuite the employee record. So we can have the employee, and then we could have their supervisor, and we could say that they're allowed to have anytime they create a vendor bill, if it's, let's say, up to $2,000, they create it, it automatically goes through. If it's over $2,000, then it has to go up to the next level. Now, on that original employee's record, right, they had a supervisor. That supervisor has an employee record. They have their next supervisor and the dollar amount that they can approve up to. So you could see that by using the fields and the records in there, a simple workflow could work for that to be able to write it and follow through. Okay. But now we start asking our questions. Okay, is that enough? Or are there some exceptions that we need to write? It's great for all vendor bills unless it's in this certain category, right? Now in that category, maybe, maybe it's supplies and we want a certain person now to approve those. Now we're getting a little off course, right? So that's where we want to map out that process, right? And it's like, okay, is it just a simple, or now are we saying for these type of materials, we want it to go this route, or these types of bills, right? We want it to go this route, and these types of bills, we want it to go this route. Now we're adding in a little complexity, right? So is workflow the right route, or do we really want to start thinking about SuiteScripts? Another example, we have a new customer that we're setting up in NetSuite. Great. If you're in a smaller company, right, maybe you've got one or two people that are helping set up that record because, we're wearing many hats in our smaller companies. We don't have as many departments. So workflow might work. We set up the fields, we're collaborating between the two of us, and now we're ready to send it on to sales or whoever needs to do the approval for that new customer record setup. Great. We get into a bigger, more enterprise level, right? We've got our customer record that we're setting up. Well, our sales team wants some information on that custom record or that customer's record. Our financial team needs to put some information on that customer record, right? Our customer service team maybe has some information that they want to put on that record. So we've got all these different departments that need to provide information so that that customer and all the information on it can flow through for the processes. This is where maybe we want to consider start looking at a SuiteScript, and then we can take the chunks, right, and make sure that all the different departments get the opportunity to fill in their information. And again, this is where we could put some of that data validation on there too, right? All right, I am approving for the sales department. I need to make sure that all these fields are filled in. Now it can move on to the next one. Now I'm in the financial department, right? I'm going to do the check their credit. I'll, get their tax ID, all that information. Now I'm going to have my information that I need to fill in. Validation there, right? To make sure that all those fields are filled in. Now I need to move it to the next department. Or, can this all be happening at once? And then, Greg's code is going to write the validation at the end to make sure that everything was filled in that needed to be before we can actually make this customer active and make it available for use in our sales orders or on our estimates or wherever we want it to be able to be used. So that's where we can kind of, make that decision based on looking at that process. Can it just be a workflow, or do we need to take the complexity to the next level of SuiteScripts? Greg, anything you want to add on that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Now we're going to get into and this is where I bring in Greg as my expert, right? We've got our sales order. We've created our item fulfillment. We've shipped the product out to the customer. Now we want to automate that invoice. And when we automate that invoice creation, right? So we've got the sales order, we shipped it. Now we want to create a invoice for it. So we might have some, some rules around that, right? That's going to auto create the invoice. And then we want to be able to send that invoice out to maybe the person that originally placed the order. And maybe they've got, somebody in their finance team that they want to get it. And maybe they want our sales guy, right, to know that that invoice went out. So we want to email multiple people. And depending on the type of order that it was, we might have different language in that email for some, so we've got different templates put together. So that's where we can have Greg write some scripting to be able to identify those various rules and touch points to be able to put it all together to create the invoice, send the email to those multiple people, and make sure that the verbiage in that email is representative of the type of order that was sent out. Okay. And then our final one, just leaving it alone, right? So a process that changes every month because it depends, right? It depends. We do it this time because this incident reoccurred, or we do it this way, or it's just a new process that we're not quite sure of. So we want to run the gamut of a little bit of manual so we can really define what those rules are and make sure that we're taking everything into consideration. Okay. All right. I think we have another poll question.
We'll go ahead and launch the fourth and final polling question on the screen. What additional support or resources do you think would help your organization maximize its NetSuite investment? So for those of you who are on NetSuite, would it be a shorter subscription term? Would it be having fewer Suite apps installed? reducing partner of record involvement, or having customized training and system health checks. So this is really interesting. And on the topic of a Suite app or anything like that, as you're thinking about whether you're using a workflow, writing the code, how does it factor in, for instance, in the topic of accounts payable, when it makes sense for a company to use native functionality versus bringing in an app and connecting an app?
Yeah. So that's, well, it depends on the processes too, right? NetSuite is a great ERP system that has a lot to offer in the software itself, but it's also done a great job, right? We talked 20, 25 years in the business, that they've done a lot of partnering
Yes.
with, right? Perfect example, NetSuite does a great job on bill capture, right? I mean, you can, use NetSuite's bill capture. It's going to try and, so for those of you, if you're not familiar with it, a bill capture says, I'm going to read a vendor bill that comes in, right? I've got the capability of reading it. It's going to look for my purchase order number. It's going to look for, or it's just going to create my vendor bill, seeing that it's this vendor and it's for this item and it's this dollar amount. So it's going to read it and automatically create the vendor bill that can be routed for approvals, right? Great that NetSuite's got that. But again, there might be more complexities around that you're billing. Maybe it's not so easy to be able to identify that item that's on there because of the way the vendor bills come in. So now you've got another company that works great with NetSuite that's called Bill.com, that they can take the aspects of NetSuite, right? As we're working with our vendors and we've got source of truth in NetSuite for our vendors and maybe our items, but we're also taking it out into that Bill.com, and they can help us organize, because it's, maybe it's expense items and regular inventory items. They can help organize that and be able to create the bills and then be able to hit the financial impacts back into NetSuite.
Thanks for addressing that, Leslie. And I do think that those are conversations and questions. And I mean, that speaks right here to the polling question, right? What additional support or resources would be helpful, because there are so many tools. There's native functionality. There's the ability to build, right? Like in the Suite apps, like we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
There's partner apps, and there's a lot of overlapping functionality, but working with a team like GVO who knows what the swim lanes are, where they intersect, where they connect. It's a different fact pattern for every single company.
It is. And that's why we always start with just a little requirements gathering, right? So, the best thing that I could say for any company is really try and put your process to paper, because if you can identify, and like Greg said, if you can write your process or you could put it in a Visio, you've got a handle on what it looks like, then we can figure out the right tools to support that, right?
And for the audience, this is the fourth and final polling question. We'll leave it open a little longer. It's unpacking a whole bunch of conversation topics here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the partner of record and what that is for those who are with us who might not be as embedded within the NetSuite ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So partner of record is really who helps you with your NetSuite subscription. So there's the concept of NetSuite Direct, right? Or you can have somebody like goVirtualOffice that is the partner of record that works with NetSuite to when your subscriptions, right, to get that original subscription and determine what all, because NetSuite is a full ERP, right? So what we turn on, what we turn off, what modules your company may need. So either we can work with you and become your partner of record that helps work with NetSuite to make sure that we're setting up your system correctly and helping you manage that. There is the concept of working directly with NetSuite too, but of course we're going to be biased and always say that it helps to have someone like us, because we're going to look at you from business experience too. Like I said, I've been in manufacturing, operations, purchasing, customer service, so I can help you, being in those areas of business with you. We can help make sure that we get the right functionality set up in NetSuite with you.
And that's so important, because when we think about training, one of the most prevalent ways that we learn is on-the-job training. And on-the-job training extends beyond just the training that takes place with our colleagues who are employees of our company. On-the-job training also is part of the extended community of support that we have, which might be a vendor, it might be a partner of record, someone who's helping from their experience and their expertise and showing the next steps of what's possible within your tech stack and for your workflows and for your processes. So as we think about that level of involvement, I think it's helpful to think that that is part of our professional development, along with webinars like this one, to give us a shout out, right? As I close the polling question, we do have an overwhelming response here about customized training and health system checks. And so that's, I think, a very loud voice in the audience that we should pay attention to.
Absolutely, yes. And Greg, you can talk about this too a little bit. That's one thing that we do as consultants. A lot of times clients will come to us and say, hey, our system really seems, why does it take 2 minutes for us to create a sales order, right? And that's where we get in there and we could see, oh yeah, you've got 3 different workflows that 3 different people have written that are trying to, work as you're creating that sales order. And so it's got to go through the one and then the other one and the other one. And that's where Greg could say, you know what? I see what you guys are trying to do here. And I could take those 3 workflows and put them into one script, and we can make that efficient and make it run a little bit faster. So now we take that 2-3 seconds, which doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it can be, right? When you're trying to do, especially if you're trying to upload, but even when you're trying to do it, I mean, let's say 10 seconds, right? 2 plus just the time that it takes to fill in the information. Now you're looking at 10 seconds to wait for that sales order to close. You're already ready, right? In the world we live in today, we're already ready to move on to number 2, number 3 task. And you're still waiting for that sales order to say the close.
And that's where Greg comes in with his cape, right?
Yep. And he saves the day. Absolutely.
Reduce the number of clicks. I hosted a group once and they talked about the number of clicks. And I will tell you, I do not touch my mouse in the same way now. I'm like, that was 5 clicks. Surely there's a better way to do this.
Right? Yeah. And again, we talked about it at the beginning. If it's a task that you do day in and day out, and it's the same process, is there something that we could do to help you, automate that? Or is there, an option for another way to be able to do it? Mm-hmm.
And I think what's impressed me and surprised me is how quickly the technology is changing, where the things I was doing last year that I felt friction with, that I would have put on a bug me list if I had one, suddenly there's 3 options that are now starting to be like built into some of the work platforms I use, whether it's Google, whether it's a paying virtual assistant. Now there's just a lot more integration and functionality that's possible.
Yeah. And that's where, and Greg, feel free to jump in here too. So, and just remember, right, we work with a lot of different NetSuite customers. So we've got that institutional knowledge of, it's a pain point for you, but guess what? We might have already helped solve that pain point with another client, and we've got some ideas, right? And we've got a starting point. Now, maybe there's some uniquenesses to your type of business or what you do, but we've got an idea that we can bring to the table because we've already seen something similar in another client.
And that's really valuable to have that perspective across businesses. And I think that brings us right into some of these best practices to review.
Absolutely. So again, right, make sure you know your process first. If you can outline it, we can help automate it, right? And we also want to make sure that we're solving, right? And there are times when there's tasks that make sense, but we really want to help solve that business problem for you too. And we're going to always try and start with standard NetSuite functionality, because again, one of the things we talked about is over customizing. We don't want to make it too complicated. If there's something, NetSuite's got lots of functionality in there, and maybe it's just something that you aren't aware of that we can help bring to the table. And, we talked just a short second, Greg and I were talking about this as an example. So we talked about that invoice automation. There is the idea in NetSuite of creating invoices. So once that item has been shipped out, you can, natural functionality out of NetSuite is to create the invoice. But maybe there is a custom step that you need to consider in there, but that's what we'll do. Is there natural NetSuite functionality that can do it for you, or do we need to consider customization? And is that in a workflow or a SuiteScript? Okay. And then we want to make sure we're doing testing, right? So that's why it's good to understand those processes, because we're going to create that automation. And like Greg said, if we create that automation with bad data or a bad process, all it's going to do is amplify it, right? So we want to make sure we do some testing on it before we release it. And then we always want to review on a regular basis, because processes change, right? And that's where you want that ownership of it, to make sure as things evolve and change, we're taking that into consideration with the automation, and we're making sure that we're updating it accordingly.